welcome to Themis Podcasts. Themis is a risk management firm specialising in financial crime. Our aim of these podcasts is to bring you interesting news, interviews and recordings of our exclusive events from the world of financial crime. Tackling environmental destruction and financial crime. In this podcast, brought to you in the lead up to COP26, Carel van Randwyck, Chief Growth Officer at Themis, speaks to award-winning investigative journalist and environmental campaigner Clare Rewcastle-Brown about her work in the nexus of environmental and financial crime in Southeast Asia.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest Themis podcast. Many of you who know me will know that I'm passionate about the environment and how business can have a positive impact on the environment. Unfortunately, many have a detrimental impact. In some cases, there is an overlap between those businesses that adversely impact the environment, commit environmental crimes, and are involved in financial crimes. It is my great pleasure today to be discussing how these areas intersect. Over the next hour, we will consider the impacts on climate change of environmental crimes, such as illegal logging, the associated financial crimes, and the role financial institutions can play in tackling these crimes. In the coming weeks, much of the world will be focused on climate change in the run-up to COP26 being hosted by the UK. As a firm that specialises in fighting financial crime, Themis has a keen interest in the links between environmental and financial crimes. In the end, these crimes are driven by money, greed, and corruption. Today, I'm joined by award-winning investigative journalist and environmental campaigner Clare Rewcastle-Brown, who has worked tirelessly to expose the devastation wrought on tropical rainforests in Southeast Asia, and in particular Sarawak and Papua New Guinea, by either poor management practice and/or illegal logging. Clare, I'm delighted to welcome you to this Themis podcast.
Well, thank you so much for your interest, and if I can find people who are willing to listen, particularly people who are in a position to do things about it, then I'm very happy to, communicate everything I can about the issues that I've been working with.
Well, we look forward to hearing from you, and if I could start by asking you to tell us a bit about the Sarawak report and how and why you founded the organisation.
Well, yes, I sort of came to it by a sort of confluence of life developments. I had been born in Sarawak, which is in the Borneo jungle, the eastern part of Malaysia, and grown up there and had my sort of formative memories in that utterly beautiful part of the world that was still completely forested and inhabited by its indigenous peoples at that time. And then, of course, came back with my family, came to school and forged a career away from all of that in Chile, UK. And I guess maybe the huge contrast of environmental experiences perhaps, firmed in my mind what a special place this tropical rainforest had been. And I continued my interest. I became a London-based journalist, and for many years I was running around doing TV reports about totally London-centric issues. But at the back of my mind was this other world, and my family continued to travel. So I had a combination of understanding how important the rainforest was, appreciating it, and also very early knowledge about the destruction that was going on all over the world as my family moved from place to place. During the 60s, 70s, 80s, we could see how the explosion of technology and consumerism and of just globalization had spurred the speed of resource extraction to an unprecedented, unbelievable pace. And of course, I knew that this was going on in Borneo, one of the most valuable remaining environments on the planet. And then I actually stopped my work for a while, went freelance, and found almost immediately that I had an invitation to go and speak at an environment and media conference in none other than Kuching, Sarawak, where I was born. What an opportunity! Of course, I took up the offer and went back and spoke at that environment conference, which was rather a spurious event, I have to say, and started to make my contacts with local journalists and to refresh my understanding of what was going on, which was devastating deforestation in the third largest rainforest of the world, the most biodiverse corner of the world, one of the key places where the Darwinian theory of evolution had actually been pulled together. It was a tragedy that I realized was happening, and I felt I just couldn't let it drop, so I kept looking into that.
Well, thank you for giving us that detailed explanation of your journey up to that particular point. And you have done some incredible investigative work on what has been happening in Sarawak, and we'll come on to Papua New Guinea in a moment. But if I could just set the scene a little bit, that our rainforests act as vital carbon sinks, absorbing large quantities of carbon dioxide and mitigating some of the effects of global warming. And yet they're disappearing at an alarming rate. Without action to change current trends, up to 1.7 million square kilometers of forest could be destroyed in these places by 2030, more than 80% of total projected forest losses globally. For those listeners in Europe, imagine a forest stretching across Germany, France, Spain, and Portugal, wiped out in just 20 years. As we approach the climate change summit, COP26, this issue has never been more important. Claire, would you please paint a picture for our listeners of the extent of this devastation, how it impacts the environment and the surrounding communities which live in those unique, pristine environments?
Well, yes, it's an interesting analogy you drew of the huge swathe of Europe that has gone, and of course that was all at one point forested, but it took over 1,000 years to deforest that area, which we did assiduously, of course, and technology has meant that we've been able to do the same in less than 2 decades on the jungle island of Borneo, and what I saw when I went back to Borneo was the devastation, the fact that an enormous jungle, the most valuable natural heritage, scientific heritage and resource and great beauty, obviously, had been absolutely wiped out. Just to cash in on that timber, and I saw the impact on not only the wildlife but the people, the indigenous people who had for millennia lived off those forests. This had all been done in the name of modernization and progress for them and development. But of course, they got nothing out of it. They got no cash. They got no buildings. They got no hospitals. They got no schools, and they lost their means of survival. Their rivers were polluted. The entire area was replaced by the mass rolling out of cash crops, particularly palm oil plantations, now acacia, fast wood growing areas. But none of this profit was going to the local people, wasn't going into their development or progress or education. Indeed, of course, the consequences, the environmental consequences of monocultures, I'm sure our audience will be well aware of. So this was about raising vast sums of cash from vast areas of the planet for a tiny number of people. I'm a journalist, and so that's how I approached it. Who's doing this and why? What's the real reason behind this? And the real reason was greed, crime, corruption, poor governance. The reason this was going on was because of the corruptibility of the handful of people who had seized control of the government. And once they'd seized control, they were pouring money into their own pockets in a symbiotic relationship that they very rapidly had developed. I still try to work out who's in whose pocket here, with the massive timber companies. which were themselves family concerns, extended family concerns. There's 6 major timber companies in Sarawak, and they are, interrelated mafia-style family companies who are symbiotically working with the politicians in that state. And the richer that machine becomes, the more impossible it has been for any opposition to stand up against it. They control everything, they have all the money, and they just steamroll a blackmail bribe, control all the instruments of state, and I might say come down very heavily on the media. Now I'm trying to sort of give you, that overview, so understand the helplessness of many countries in the world who are caught up in that kind of engine of state capture, effectively, by powerful but limited family interests, such as happened in Sarawak. And, none of the journalists who were filling me in on all this and telling me about the billionaire family, the Tide family, who had controlled Sarawak for decades, could write about it themselves, because, Malaysia has appallingly oppressive media laws that can be utilized against journalists. They can be thrown into jail under all sorts of, crimes. And in fact, I've been charged with most of them by now. And so there was a role I could see for me, which as a foreign journalist, utilizing the internet, I could get to work on distance. So that's what I did. I set up a blog and I started writing about what was going on and directly challenging the wealth, the inexplicable wealth of these politicians who were supposed to be on fixed government salaries, but who yet I was able to trace owned vast properties in the advanced economies, in Britain, in the United States, Australia, Canada. The Tide family have huge properties, as do their symbiotic cousins, the timber companies that fund their government. So I took up a direct stand against these people, and that's been the work I've been doing. And then moving on to Papua New Guinea, which you mentioned, having exposed Tide Mahmood in the way I did, and in fact, very satisfactorily, actually, it caused him immense political problems when at last actually a media organization was able to stand up and speak the truth against Tide. He started to lose at least the urban vote, just left. People started to realize why their country was as it was and why Tide was so rich. It was because he had stolen and plundered from the country, and I was saying it, and he wasn't daring to sue me for it. And so that lost him his job in the end. The Federal Prime Minister of Malaysia kicked him upstairs and made him governor and took his hands off the levers of government. So I could see that, with a free press, you can make movement on this, and I was getting the message out to other media and so forth by just carrying on talking about this. Moving to Papua New Guinea, what these companies have done have become global concerns for all of us. The Sarawak 6 companies are amongst the biggest timber companies globally. They made an absolute fortune not making a profit in Sarawak. They cashed in a rainforest and then claimed that it couldn't be taxed because they made no profit. They were doing it out of the goodness of their hearts, apparently. So no money went back into the state, no money went into Malaysia. All of this profit was exported out through the offshore system and into further logging all over Southeast Asia. The Solomon Islands have been raised by these same cartels of Malaysian companies, and they're into Papua New Guinea, which we can talk about in a second. It was just an appalling example of state capture by a neo-colonialist enterprise run by resource-grabbing big business. But they're also in the Congo. They're in the Amazon. They're in they're in Siberia, China, and they're exporting to us. So on this question of what's happening in places like Papua New Guinea, you see, I went there and filmed there in 2019, and in the course of a couple of weeks, I just absolutely saw laid out before me a reproduction of what had happened in Sarawak. They went in with a huge amount of money into a remote place, which had become independent, but still had very weak governance, very weak institutions, a very underaware population of remote, isolated people with very traditional backgrounds and lives. And these logging companies came in and told the political leadership that they could make them individually fabulously rich. And that's what we saw. They bought up all the decision-making key people that they needed, or had them replaced if necessary, both at a local level, going in and perverting the way that local groups and local councils who could give licenses and give permissions for logging, they would go in, they would buy up the few crucial people, they would promise massive amounts of money, they would promise to bring roads and development and schools, and then, you know, having got the signature on the piece of paper, they then steamroller in with their massive logging equipment, and they strip the area and they leave the locals with absolutely nothing. I then went on and looked at how basically the only thing that these local people can get out of the awful situation is that they're in is to act as indentured stroke slave labor, as they called it, on the subsequent palm oil plantations that these timber companies then roll out. They're now plantation companies as well. Of course, they're into everything now, but they're rolling out hundreds of thousands of acres of palm oil in Papua New Guinea, where the beautiful forests used to exist. And that's the only living left for the indigenous people, is to work for penurious amounts of money on those palm oil plantations. And I went and saw the situation. I think we're going to talk about, I'm sure you're going to ask about, slave labor and human trafficking. This is one of the most penurious examples I've ever come across in my reporting career of a nation effectively enslaved in these plantations. You could be back on the sugar islands of the 18th century, frankly, when you visit Papua New Guinea.
That is quite a horrific description of what has happened to the absolutely unique rainforests in Sarawak and Papua New Guinea. And you mentioned there slavery and indentured individuals, the communities who were free previously, who relied on the local environment for their livelihood as well as for their own resources, and are now no longer able to rely on that. I'd looked at your 2019 film reporting on the activities of the logging companies in Papua New Guinea, and it was horrific to see the lack of protection that the individuals receive for conducting the logging activities, as well as working on the plantations, dealing with pesticides and other activities that they have to. Could you describe a little bit more about your understanding, what you saw, and to what extent is it across the whole area, the country that has been deforested, rather than just a small area? Does it apply to all the forests that have been denuded of their original trees and vegetation?
Yes, I mean, I crisscrossed quite a few different communities in different parts of Papua New Guinea during that one trip, and it's not just a monoculture; it's a single outcome, for all the people who've been caught up. They're in the same, horrible situation. So there's no variety in what it's done to the indigenous people of Papua New Guinea. They all describe themselves to me as slaves in their own land. That's how they feel. They feel they've been invaded by big capital, which has captured their decision makers, their lawmakers, has suborned and corrupted the people who are supposed to be looking after their interests, have lied to them, and they are left. I went up and visited some of these very remote camps, and families are living in the most squalid and disgusting conditions that have been provided for them by these companies, who have so much wealth. And actually, at the time I went in 2019, there had been a drastic downturn at that time in the palm oil market. So that it was a really interesting example, actually, of how these companies operate, because suddenly they weren't making money out of oil palm, so they just laid everybody off. So at the time I went there, they'd laid off, in some of the areas I visited, 90% of the workforce, just like that. And I mean, I hope that that subsequently, if the market picked up, some of those people may have been given some jobs back. But at that time, they were just left with nothing, trying to find their way home to get back to their villages, where they might hope to be able to grow potatoes and yam to survive again, but being given no payoff money, no basic care or commitment at all. Now, the remaining people that I visited in the camp, as I say, were living in squalor and receiving the most ludicrously low sums of money for their labor. I remember being incredibly touched by some of the conditions. I mean, obviously no running water. They were having to drink from what they could capture from the rain coming off the roof. They had a polluted stream, down by the facilities, no proper, washing or toilet facilities. And they had a sort of roofless, wall-less church. They're very religious. They're Christians in Papua New Guinea, and so this was the centre of their little encampment, was the church, that they were only allowed off one day a week on Sunday, and they would spend a lot of that time in this dilapidated church. And the rest of the time they would be working. There was no school. So the kids that they were having together in these, they would be running around them while they worked on the plantation and then growing up to help their parents. This was not progress and development that was promised. I went to other areas where, the workmen would tell me how hard they had to work. And, they would then have to carry these heavy burdens, these heavy branches of fruit for, up to a mile up a road in these plantations, when the pickup truck might come and get them. It really just total disdain, treated as subhumans, and in this day and age, just outrageous that companies should be able to get away with it, over an entire country like Papua New Guinea.
And what is their means of redress? What are their local political representatives doing to help them and to seek from the logging companies their commitment to the legal agreements that they've signed to in support of their activities? Because I'm assuming, and this is from your 2019 film, you indicated that the logging companies had signed agreements with the local community and the community elders and leaders, but there must be some form of redress so that they can get their livelihoods back.
Well, I put my investigative hat on, obviously, as a journalist confronted with this situation. Those agreements with community leaders turn out to be highly suspect if you take the slightest look at them. And time and again, what these logging companies come in and do is they come in, they splash a bit of money, and they buy up one or two people within the community, who then help them deceive the rest of the community, or they split the community, or they'll get signatures under pretenses of something else, or they'll just forge signatures. They will set people up as representatives of the community when they're not. In fact, I ended up interviewing quite a lot of people, as you'd have seen in that film, who admitted that they'd played that role and regretted it. Against their own communities, because at the time they'd conned themselves, I suppose, that they were doing the right thing by bringing in the loggers, but then when they saw the consequences, they admitted it, they regretted it, and they admitted that their communities often who can't read or write, had been, conned. I had one example where a community representative had been encouraged to sign a document. He'd asked to have his own lawyer, and the timber company had absolutely refused to allow him a lawyer, and had actually sort of threatened that if they got a lawyer, then they would drop the deal, and that all the promised money that never came anyway wouldn't come. So there's not really a tactic that they won't descend to. And in another case, in other cases, police would arrive at night in a village with guns and require that forms be signed, forms which were then used as signed consent for their forests to be logged. Other examples are where a huge 300,000 hectare plantation, logging first and then plantation, exists in the Vanimo area of Papua New Guinea. And that was signed over by supposedly a community agreement. But when I looked into it, it turned out that what had happened was that community leaders had been encouraged by a local MP to sign a form that they understood would enable him to advocate on their behalf, to get the best opportunities from their from these loggers who are wanting to come in. Of course, the people who gave that permission were only of limited authority to do so anyway. But it took them a year before they realized what they'd actually signed was a power of attorney, which they gave to their MP, that enabled him to act on behalf of the entire community. And then mysteriously, the entire rights to the area's logging was then signed over to an offshore company, who we don't know owned. We don't know who owned the offshore company, but that offshore company then came in and logged the whole area. I challenged the local MP, who was quite a smooth character, actually. He said he'd do me an interview in an hour's time. He just needed to get home and freshen up. I'm still chasing him. He didn't come to the rendezvous to do the interview. So it's all very simple trickery. And if you've got a bag of money and you can arrive by helicopter and you can afford to pay the police to act on your behalf, really local remote communities, they don't have a chance to stand up to this kind of trickery, armed with lawyers, armed with bought political representatives. But if you still have trouble, if the community gets upset and maybe starts to hold placards and protest, there are resources, and you will have seen from my film how in community after community they talked about how they are brought under control by the police who work for the logging companies. They have littered Papua New Guinea with shipping containers from the ships that come in and out taking the goods. And just about every village has one of these containers, which is an airless, windowless sort of box of metal. And anyone who protests gets marched in there, locked in there for several days to ruminate on protest. It's beyond belief.
And that is a horrific description of the circumstances in which they live, and how the logging companies deal with the local communities and their representatives, and as well with those organizations who are meant to protect them. And from your investigations, what have you been able to identify in terms of discover as to the backlash or anything or any support that's coming from the political representatives in the country, or even from church communities?
I ended up speaking to the Archbishop for the area in one of his communities. He was there in his wonderful archbishopric robes. I went to his residence at Pokopo, and he expressed his despair to me. he didn't know what to do. What he'd been trying to do, having decided, everything was hopeless, he had tried to act as an intermediary, negotiating between the palm oil companies and the local residents on the basis of have some heart. Surely you have decency, please, let's have a newly reconstructed contract whereby they accept what's happened to them. They accept you've taken the land, but please give them something back. And he was trying to get the two sides to sign this. And I said to him, how can you imagine, how can you put your faith in any goodness in these companies who care just about cash, who have already shown how ruthless they are? And he said, well, I feel we have no choice. And I said to him, look, I said, what you're asking the local community to do is to legitimize, by signing this agreement, that to legitimize what these logging companies are doing. And then they have to hope that the logging companies are going to fulfill their promises this time, whereas before they never did. But they lose their legal they lose their legal weapon, which was that in the past they had not legitimized it. They had not agreed to these plantations. So actually, with the best will in the world, you could be putting them in a worse situation. You could be tying them up legally. And that Archbishop looked at me and he said, please, can people come and help us? We need help here in Papua New Guinea. And he looked at me, he asked me to help. He asked me to find people to help. And that's, that's why I'm talking to you and to others, anyone who will listen.
And before we go on, because I have a multitude of questions related to what you do. So if people do want to help, where do they go to? How do they get in touch with you or to the organizations in Papua New Guinea that are looking to help the local communities?
Well, I think what I'm trying, my first sort of point on this is we have to revisit how we, and it ties in with what you do, we have to revisit how we consider what's happening to the environment and the problem we have with climate change. We have to recontextualize it in the form that I think explains why this is going on. This is about criminal resource gathering by criminal mafia companies, and we need to identify those criminals and stand up to them and go after them and hold them to account and to demand certain standards of behavior. You mentioned your phrase illegal logging. It's a misleading phrase, because if you have a country where state capture has taken place, where the government is corrupted, as is the case in all these situations, then what's legal and what isn't? So we have to go after the criminals, identify them, admit that this is crime that we're dealing with, and proceed from there. I'm going to be holding just one event at COP. I have a small NGO, which is really just a platform for, what I and others who are working in this area are seeking to communicate. And we're going to have on that platform Gary Juffa, who is a governor of one of the provinces of Papua New Guinea. And he started as a customs officer, and he saw the extraction from grassroots level from his country and how it affected his people, how they were stripped of everything and how not a penny of tax was paid. And so that's what put him on his political path. And he has, over the years, championed his people, and he has now become governor. And there has been a change of government. There has been so much unrest amongst the people of Papua against these foreign Malaysian companies that there is now a government that is committed to attempting to reform matters. And the government now has supported Gary Juffa in setting up a 300,000 hectare conservation zone in the province that he controls, Oro province, where he has severed and disbanded and cancelled all the logging licenses that were due to cut down that area. Now he's up against the companies that are very unhappy about that, and who will be fighting back in all the ways they know best how to, with enormous resources, with lawyers, with billions at their disposal, with violent methods at their disposal, bribery and blackmail at their disposal. So he's fighting the front line, and he'll be coming and explaining just what a challenge that is at COP in Glasgow in November, together with the opposition leader of Malaysia, who actually just earlier today confirmed that he will come and join that platform. Speaking as a reformer in Malaysia who has fought the timber corruption in Malaysia. He did 10 years in jail for standing up against corruption, is currently out and has been up against the same companies over the last few weeks, trying to stop them pulling out the last bits of jungle, using the establishment with which they are in cahoots to do so back in Malaysia. So these two men are from the front line on this, and they will be appealing to the international community as recipients of these goods, as the facilitators through the offshore system, through the international finance system of this illegal logging, so to find solutions before these valuable areas are finally wiped out on the planet to all our detriment.
Yeah, it's really important that local people start to stand up and address the companies that are creating such devastation to their homeland. You mentioned earlier about shell companies, and given the natural resources that have been depleted from the country, the logs, all the wood that has been taken offshore is extremely valuable. And for me, having been in finance before joining Themis, one would have expected a lot of taxes to have been paid to the government, and for them to set up a sovereign wealth fund type of fund, which would then be able to support the local people. So this is really a fund for future generations. It doesn't seem to have happened, other than through what you mentioned earlier, bribery and corruption. What has been preventing the generation of such a future fund for the local people of Papua New Guinea?
Well, if you want to know who the richest families in the world are, take a look at these timber barons and their political allies. There's a joke that used to be made that apparently Taib Mahmood used to feel very angry as the chief minister of a poxy little state in Malaysia, i.e. Sarawak, that the Sultan of Brunei was considered the richest man in the world. Because of course he knew he was far richer than the Sultan of Brunei, but couldn't advertise the fact. The Taib family are multiple billionaires. The Yor family, the Tiong families, these are the families that are behind Samling and Rimbanan Hijau, two of the bigger timber companies, are multi-billionaires, because they are the recipients. They are the sovereign funds that received all the money that should have been invested into sustainable development and modernization and to improving people's lives in these countries. It's a straight theft.
That is something, I'm sure, for future investigations and for the information to come to light as to how they've been able to extract those sorts of funds for their own personal use. But more importantly,
but I think it's just to jump in. I think we know. They've been legitimized by their home government, thereby making it possible for a raft of Western banks to service them. They have all the money has been transfer priced through places like Singapore and Hong Kong, so that they sell to themselves and then sell on to us. The money all goes through offshore concerns that are politely run by elegant Brits who act as their lawyers and tax advisors and investment and business managers. The whole thing has been facilitated by the professional classes of Britain and America and Switzerland, frankly, including our bankers. That's how it's been done. And I'm naming names because actually this has all been proven as well. I no longer live in fear of a serious lawsuit from Tide Mahmood, Samling or Rimbanan Hijau, because it's all documented, it's all on record, that they have acted in this criminal way. They just shrug their shoulders and move on.
So given that all this information is in the public domain, what could individuals or even the financial community do to restrict the further flow of wealth to these organizations? But also we know that there are all these tax structures that have been set up, shell companies, but there must be a way in which organizations can banks particularly, who facilitate the flow of money from one organization to another, to different parts of the world, that they could be doing to highlight and stop this.
Well, at some point we're going to have to tackle offshore. We should have tackled it back in the 80s. It's now become a sort of gross addiction. You know, but vast swathes of the global economy goes through these offshore islands that are largely managed by Britain. And as a result, this criminality goes undetected. And we've seen the Pandora Papers and the Panama Papers. And, you know, what you could, you know, I mean, they shed light on what was obvious and deductible, which is that these instruments are being used to hide criminal capital and tax evading capital. And you know, interestingly, I took, rather than, you know, leaks from offshore concerns, I did take my my investigations a step further, having sort of exposed Tide Mahmood, and then I exposed the corruption of the next door state's minister as well, who was also getting hundreds of millions in kickbacks from logging companies to destroy Sabah. I started to look at how money was being stolen from Malaysia and through the offshore system, namely the 1MDB scandal. You know, I got to work on that and was able to expose through traditional journalistic methods and leaks and through whistleblowers, how in that particular one example, 6 billion was stolen by the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Tide Mahmood's boss in effect, for his own purposes, and funneled through the offshore system and back into his bank account in Malaysia to finance his incredibly lavish lifestyle, the insatiable demand of his wife for Hermes handbags and diamonds to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, and indeed, of course, you know, a whole lot of Hollywood investments in movies like Wolf of Wall Street, and it became a major scandal. But what I achieved in the process of that was a sort of cross section of how the offshore system works, the theft in the poorly governed, corrupt country being funneled through these offshore companies, through a number of banks. I mean, the leading bank in the 1MDB scandal was Goldman Sachs, who have had to pay billions in fines for their blatant criminal and corrupt behavior in this, turning a blind eye to obvious theft. And in fact, their senior Southeast Asia executive taking $100 million yes, in kickbacks. So, you know, this is blatant corruption in our financial systems that they usually get away with, these banks, because there is so little transparency in what's going on. And you know, so we went through from the theft through to the you know, the expenditures, the super yachts, the mansions in Hollywood, the movies, the lavish lifestyles. It's all there. We know it's going on, and our governments need to get together and tackle it.
Claire, we're coming up close to the end of time, and I really appreciate your description and the explanation of everything that you've uncovered, and definitely showing the links between environmental devastation, environmental crimes, financial crimes, and social crimes as well, because of the impact that all this has on local communities and people and indigenous communities who rely so much on their local environment for their livelihoods and survival. What can our listeners do to help combat the activities of these companies, and and in particular, where can they find out more about their activities and what they're doing to effectively cut off the demand for their product?
I think we've got to stop turning a blind eye. I mean, there's been a collective blind eye turned, and it begins with politics. Regulators are not being pressured by the people who hire them, the governments who hire them, to do their jobs. I tipped off numerous regulators about what was going on in Malaysia and 1MDB. Luckily, finally, given there was such a huge sum of money stolen and it went through high-profile, places in the United States, I finally was able to get the attention of the FBI and the Department of Justice, who then took the action that enabled the 1MDB scandal to be proven, to be taken to court, and for the money to be seized. But that's not happening. That's not happening in Britain. That's not happening in Switzerland. Banks are not reporting. If they do report, nothing's done. We have to demand, as a population, that our governments take regulation seriously and deal with crime seriously, because actually it doesn't benefit nearly everybody. It only benefits a handful of people who then subsidize politicians, without a doubt, and subsidize political parties in our supposedly more law-abiding countries into not tackling these glaring failings. And as a result, we're losing the diversity of our planet. Our climate's going haywire, and we're not benefiting. The average person does not benefit either in Papua New Guinea or here from rampant corruption. We're coming under the heel of a handful of terrifyingly rich people who are criminal, who have stolen massive resources, who have not paid a bean in tax on it, and who are now starting to wage terrifying levels of influence over political parties and governments in our country, because they're wealthier than many countries, these individuals and these companies. So we need to have an awareness in our in our own societies of the problems we face and the dangers that presents to nearly everybody.
Claire, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your insights and experiences with us. It has been really interesting, and you've just touched the tip of the iceberg, first of all, of what you've uncovered. I would strongly recommend people to look at your 2019 film on the activities of the logging companies in Papua New Guinea. It's all available on YouTube, and read all your interesting articles as well. But I think everybody can do their bit by, first of all, inquiring where the wood that they have in their own products, in their, let's say, wonderful teak furniture that they buy, and other wood-based products that they purchase, and find out the supply chains. Where is everything coming from? And also, obviously, our bankers and the financial system to be a little bit more transparent and investigative of the financial flows that are going through their systems. So thank you very much once again, and really appreciate the time that you've given to us and to our listeners in explaining what's going on in Sarawak and Papua New Guinea. Thank you.
Thank you for lending your ear, and I hope you will act on your commitment. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the latest Themis podcast. We hope you found it interesting and informative. If you would like to find out more about Themis, get in touch with us via our website, www.crime.financial. You can also subscribe for future news and interviews.